Jinna No stood at the window of her new quarters, watching the Earth sunset paint the sky in colors her home world never displayed. The reds were too bright, the oranges too vivid. Everything about Earth felt excessive to her Norveni senses, the gravity slightly too strong, the air too rich with oxygen, the humans themselves too loud and expressive. She adjusted her environmental regulator on her wrist, dialing down the sensory input. The device, a sleek silver band, helped Norvani diplomats function in alien environments without becoming overwhelmed. Jinnah had never needed to use it at maximum settings until arriving on Earth 3 days ago. Ambassador No, your schedule for tomorrow has been finalized, her assistant Mina said, entering the room. Mina was young for a diplomatic aide, her blue-tinted skin still showing the brightness of youth. Unlike Jinnah, who had spent years studying humans from a distance, this was Mina's first assignment involving direct contact with the species. Thank you, Jinnah replied, taking the tablet. She scrolled through the meetings, trade negotiations, cultural exchange proposals, and a formal introduction to her human counterpart, Delegate Ta-Won Kim. I've included his profile, Mina added. He has an impressive diplomatic record. Graduated top of his class at their Global Diplomatic Academy. 5 years of successful negotiations with the Centauri Coalition, and he speaks basic Norvani. Jinnah raised an eyebrow. Few humans bothered to learn even simple Norvani phrases. The language's subtle tonal variations made it challenging for human vocal cords. Perhaps he will be tolerable to work with. Then, Jinnah said, unlike the last human delegate who insisted on touching my shoulder every time we spoke. She shuddered at the memory. Norvani nervous systems were highly sensitive, and casual human touch could send uncomfortable sensory overloads through their bodies. The diplomatic briefing mentioned he specifically requested this assignment. Mina said, her head tilted curiously. Apparently he has studied Norvani culture extensively. Jinnah made a non-committal sound. She had heard such claims before, usually from humans who had read a single article about her people and considered themselves experts. Ambassador Sen was asking if you would join some of the human diplomats for dinner tonight. Mina ventured carefully. He thinks it would be a good opportunity to establish personal connections. Jinnah turned from the window. Ambassador Sen has been on Earth too long. He's forgetting proper Norvani restraint. She straightened her formal robes, the deep purple fabric signifying her rank. We establish professional relationships, not personal ones. Particularly not with humans. Mina looked down, but not before Jinnah caught her disappointed expression. You're curious about them, Jinnah observed. Mina nodded reluctantly. They're so different from us. The way they express emotions so openly, their art, their music. She stopped, noticing Jinnah's disapproving look. That emotional volatility is precisely why I will never date a human, Jinnah stated firmly. Their diplomatic decisions are compromised by feelings rather than facts. Their relationships are chaotic and unstable. She picked up her own tablet, signaling the end of the conversation. You may observe them, Mina, but maintain professional distance. That's how successful diplomats operate. The next morning, Jinnah arrived early at the Earth Diplomatic Center, a sprawling complex of glass and sustainable materials. The main meeting room offered a panoramic view of the city, though Jinnah kept her focus on her notes rather than the distracting skyline. She was reviewing trade proposals when the door opened. A human male entered, dressed in formal diplomatic attire, a simple dark suit with the Earth Coalition insignia. He was shorter than many human males but carried himself with confidence. Ambassador No, he said, stopping at a respectful distance and offering the traditional Norvani greeting gesture, hands pressed together, fingertips pointing upward. His pronunciation was surprisingly accurate. I am Delegate Ta-Won Kim. It's an honor to meet you. Jinnah returned the gesture, hiding her surprise at his correct protocol. Delegate Kim, your pronunciation is acceptable. He smiled slightly. I had an excellent teacher, Ambassador Lee spent 3 years trying to help me master the fourth tone distinction. I'm still working on it. Jinnah recognized the name. Ambassador Lee had been posted to Earth a decade ago. You've been studying our language for some time then. Yes, I find your culture fascinating, particularly your diplomatic approaches. The Norvani ability to separate personal bias from negotiation strategy is something humans could learn from. Jinnah assessed him carefully. His compliments seemed genuine rather than manipulative. Perhaps we should begin with the proposed agricultural exchange, she said, gesturing to the meeting table. They spent the next 3 hours reviewing proposals. Jinnah found herself impressed despite her initial skepticism. Taiwan was thorough, logical, and respectful of Norvani communication styles. He didn't interrupt, didn't use unnecessary physical gestures, and presented evidence-based arguments. When the meeting concluded, Jinnah had to admit, if only to herself, that he was perhaps the most competent human diplomat she had encountered. I've taken the liberty of preparing some additional data on the mineral rice question, Taiwan said as they gathered their materials. Would you prefer I send it digitally, or would you like to discuss it over the midday meal? Jinnah hesitated. Sharing meals was a common human bonding ritual, one she typically avoided. However, the mineral rights issue was a priority for her mission. I will review it over a meal, she decided. However, I require a low-sensory environment. Of course, he replied smoothly. I've reserved a private room at the diplomatic dining facility. They're familiar with Norvani dietary and environmental needs. As they walked to the dining facility, Jinnah noticed other diplomats watching them with interest. The Norvani-Earth relationship had been formally cordial but distant for decades. The meal was unexpectedly productive. Taiwan's proposal for shared mining technology would benefit both planets, and he had anticipated her concerns about environmental impact. You've done thorough research, she acknowledged as they finished. It's my job, he replied simply. And I believe our planets have more to offer each other than the current limited exchanges. Jinnah left the meeting with a strange feeling. The human delegate was competent, respectful, intelligent, even. But she reminded herself that one productive meeting didn't change fundamental truths. Humans and Norvani were too different in their approaches to life, to relationships, to everything that mattered. I will never date a human, she repeated to herself that evening as she updated her mission log. It was a statement of obvious fact, not worth dwelling on. Yet somehow, she found herself adding a note about Delegate Kim's unusual understanding of Norvani customs. It was purely professional observation, she told herself, nothing more. 3 weeks into her Earth assignment, Jinnah found herself spending more time with Taiwan than any other diplomat. The interplanetary trade agreement required daily meetings, often stretching late into the evening. Today they were working in the diplomatic complex's eastern wing, reviewing agricultural exchange protocols. The Norvani soil enrichment technique could increase Earth's crop yields by 30%, Taiwan said, studying the data on his tablet. But I'm concerned about how it might affect our native soil bacteria. Jinnah nodded. A valid concern. On Norvax, we tested for 5 growing seasons before full implementation. She pulled up additional research files. These compatibility studies might address your questions. As she leaned forward to share her screen, the lights suddenly flickered and died. A moment later, the floor trembled slightly beneath them. Power outage, Taiwan said, activating his tablet's light function. The backup generators should engage soon. Jinnah's environmental regulator beeped softly before shutting down. Without it, Earth's sensory input would gradually become overwhelming. She took measured breaths, focusing on maintaining calm. We should return to the main complex, she suggested, gathering her materials. They entered the corridor, which was illuminated only by emergency lighting strips along the floor. Other diplomats were also moving toward the exits. As they approached the lift that would take them to the ground level, Taiwan hesitated. We shouldn't use the lift during a power outage, he advised. The stairs are this way. Jinnah followed him toward the stairwell. Just as they reached it, the building shook more violently. The emergency lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. "Minor earthquake," Ta-One explained, his voice calm in the darkness. "They happen occasionally in this region." The lights flickered back momentarily, just enough for them to see the stairwell door was jammed. Then darkness returned. "Let's try the lift instead," Jinnah suggested. "Even if it's not operational, the doors might be open." They carefully made their way back to the lift. The doors were indeed partially open, revealing the lift itself stuck between floors. With Ta-One's tablet providing minimal light, they'd managed to pry the doors open wide enough to enter. "We can wait here," Ta-One said. "Emergency services will check the lifts first." Jinnah sat down against the wall, maintaining a proper distance from her human colleague. Without her regulator, she was already beginning to feel Earth's heavier gravity more acutely. The air seemed too thick, the sounds from the buildings settling too sharp. "Are you all right?" Ta-One asked, noticing her discomfort. "My environmental regulator is offline," she explained. "It will be uncomfortable, but not dangerous." Ta-One nodded. "Would it help if I remained quiet?" The offer surprised her. Most humans filled silence with needless conversation, especially in tense situations. "Yes," she admitted. "Thank you." They sat in silence for several minutes. Jinnah used Norvani meditation techniques to manage her increasingly sensitive nervous system. The quiet darkness helped. Finally, Ta-One spoke softly. "May I ask you something about Norvani culture? It might help distract from the waiting." Jinnah considered refusing, but found herself curious about what he might ask. "You may. I've read that Norvani art focuses on mathematical patterns rather than representative images. Is that preference cultural or biological?" It was an unexpectedly thoughtful question. "Both," Jinnah replied. "Our visual processing centers respond more strongly to complex patterns than to representational images. Our earliest art forms were mathematical sequences expressed visually." "Like your language symbols," Ta-One observed. "Yes, each character contains embedded mathematical relationships. When properly written, they create neural resonance for Norvani readers." Their conversation continued, moving from art to literature to diplomatic history. Jinnah was surprised to find herself asking questions about human culture as well. Ta-One's explanations were refreshingly free of the emotional excesses that typically characterized human descriptions. "So human music deliberately evokes emotional responses?" she asked. "Yes. Different tonal patterns trigger different neurochemical reactions," he explained. "Some human musicians can make listeners feel specific emotions with just a few notes." "That would be considered manipulation on Norvax," Jinnah noted. Ta-One smiled in the dim light. "On Earth, it's considered art." Hours passed with no rescue. Jinnah's discomfort grew as her nervous system struggled with unfiltered Earth stimuli. She tried to hide it, but Ta-One noticed her shaking hands. "Your regulator is more essential than you indicated," he observed. "It's manageable," she insisted, though the tremors were worsening. Ta-One hesitated. "There's a human technique that might help. It involves applying pressure to specific nerve points to reduce sensory input. I studied it when preparing for diplomatic service with sensitive species." Jinnah was skeptical but desperate for relief. "What does it require?" "I would need to press specific points on your wrists and the base of your skull," he explained. "It involves touch, but with firm, steady pressure rather than light contact, which I understand is more tolerable for Norvani." Under normal circumstances, Jinnah would have refused immediately. The thought of a human touching her, especially near her sensitive neural clusters, was almost unthinkable. But the building pressure in her skull was becoming unbearable. "You may try," she conceded. Ta-One moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'll explain everything before I do it," he promised. He guided her through the process, pressing firmly on specific points. To Jinnah's surprise, the pressure actually helped, creating a counterpoint to the overwhelming sensory input. "How did you learn this technique?" she asked as the pain in her head began to subside. "I had a Norvani language teacher who experienced similar issues on Earth. She taught me this method after a classroom environmental system failure." The tremors in Jinnah's hands gradually stopped. Taiwan returned to his side of the lift, respecting her space now that the crisis had passed. "Thank you," Jinnah said quietly. "You would have done the same," he replied simply. It was then that Jinnah realized something unexpected had happened. She had allowed a human to touch her, had trusted him enough to permit it. More surprisingly, she had found comfort in the contact rather than distress. When rescue finally came 3 hours later, Jinnah found herself strangely reluctant to end their conversation. They had discussed topics she rarely shared with anyone, not even fellow Norvani. As they emerged into the main complex, Jinnah's aide Minna rushed toward her with a replacement regulator. "Ambassador, we were so worried. Are you all right?" Jinnah adjusted the new device, feeling her systems return to balance. "I am well," she said. Delegate Kim was helpful. Later that evening, Jinnah recorded her daily mission log. She noted the power failure and earthquake as minor incidents. What she didn't record was how, for the first time since arriving on Earth, she had laughed, at one of Taiwan's observations about the absurdity of interspecies diplomatic protocols. "I will never date a human," she reminded herself as she prepared for sleep. But for the first time, the statement felt less like a fundamental truth and more like a personal rule, one that, theoretically, could be broken. Jinnah sat still as Dr. Park moved the scanner slowly over her abdomen. The small examination room was filled with medical equipment from both Earth and Norvex. 3 months had passed since the discovery of her pregnancy, and each week brought new surprises. "The fetal development continues to defy our understanding," Dr. Park said, studying the 3-dimensional image that appeared above the scanning bed. "The child has developed both human and Norvani organ systems, but they're working together in ways we never thought possible." Jinnah studied the image with a mixture of wonder and concern. The small form floating in the projection had the beginning structures of Norvani neural pathways alongside a human cardiovascular system. The child's skin showed hints of the subtle blue tint characteristic of Norvani, but with the warmer undertones of human coloration. "Is the baby healthy?" Taiwan asked from his position beside Jinnah. He had not left her side during any medical appointment since the discovery. "Remarkably so," Dr. Park replied. "Though we're still developing new parameters for what healthy means for this child, there is no medical precedent." Jinnah touched the image gently. "The neural structures. They're more developed than a typical Norvani fetus would be at this stage." Dr. Park nodded. "Yes, it appears the human genetic contribution is accelerating certain developmental processes, while the Norvani genetics are enhancing others. The combination is extraordinary." After the examination, Jinnah and Taiwan walked slowly through the diplomatic compound gardens. News of her pregnancy had spread quickly despite their efforts at privacy. Now they were the subject of constant speculation and scrutiny. "The Norvani High Council has requested a formal meeting," Jinnah said quietly as they sat on a bench beneath flowering trees. "They're sending a delegation next week." Taiwan took her hand, a gesture that had once seemed impossible but now felt natural. "What do you think they want?" "To examine me, to verify that this pregnancy is real and not some elaborate deception," Jinnah sighed. "And likely to pressure me to return to Norvex for the remainder of the pregnancy." "Would you go?" Taiwan asked, his voice carefully neutral though his hand tightened slightly around hers. Jinnah was silent for a long moment. "My heart says no. My duty says, I don't know anymore." That evening, Jinnah found a message waiting in her quarters. The Norvani High Council had declared her situation a matter of planetary security and scientific significance. They were demanding she return to Norvex immediately. Before she could process this, her communication terminal chimed with an incoming call from Earth's Diplomatic Security Service. Ambassador No, the human security officer said formally, "We need to discuss increased security measures for you and Delegate Kim. We've intercepted concerning communications from both human and Norvani extremist groups regarding your pregnancy." Jinnah felt a chill. What kind of communications? Both threatening and others. The officer looked uncomfortable. Some groups view your child as an abomination that threatens species purity. Others view it as some kind of prophesied miracle. Either way, you've become a target of intense interest. After the call ended, Jinnah sat in the darkness of her quarters, one hand resting on her growing abdomen. The child moved slightly beneath her touch, another new development that Dr. Park had not expected for several more weeks. "What am I going to do?" she whispered to the empty room. The Norvani delegation arrived with the formality and precision characteristic of their culture. 5 senior council members, led by Elder Daesung, the most conservative voice on the High Council. "Ambassador No," Elder Daesung said when they met in the formal reception hall. There was no warmth in his voice. "You have created an unprecedented diplomatic situation." Jinnah stood straight, refusing to show weakness. "The situation created itself, Elder. Neither Delegate Kim nor I could have anticipated this biological possibility. Nevertheless, you violated our most basic protocols regarding interaction with other species." Elder Daesung's disapproval was palpable. "You will return to Norvax with us for proper medical supervision and to remove you from the public eye until this situation resolves itself." "And Delegate Kim?" Jinnah asked coolly, though her heart was racing. "The human has no place in this discussion. This is a Norvani matter." At that moment, Taiwan entered the hall, deliberately late, a calculated move that would allow Jinnah to establish her position first. "With respect, Elder," Taiwan said, bowing in perfect Norvani fashion, "this is not solely a Norvani matter. The child Jinnah carries is equally human." Elder Daesung barely glanced at him. "Human claims to the offspring are immaterial. Ambassador No is Norvani, and she will comply with council directives." Jinnah felt a surge of anger unlike anything she had experienced before. The pregnancy had changed her body chemistry, making her emotions more difficult to suppress in the Norvani manner. "I will not be ordered about like a diplomatic package," she said firmly. "This child is unprecedented in our shared history. Its existence may open new understandings between our species. I will not allow either Earth or Norvax to claim sole authority over its future or mine." The stunned silence that followed her declaration was broken by a commotion at the entrance to the hall. Dr. Park rushed in, his usual composure shattered. "Ambassador, you must come quickly," he said. "The latest scans we took this morning. There's something you need to see immediately." In the medical facility, Dr. Park displayed the new images with shaking hands. The fetus had grown significantly just since the previous day. More startling were the brain scans, which showed activity patterns unlike anything seen in either species. The neural activity suggests the possibility of telepathic capability, Dr. Park explained. "The human-Norvani combination has created something entirely new." News of the scan results leaked to the media within hours. Overnight, Jinnah and Taiwan's child became the center of an interstellar sensation. Human religious groups proclaimed miraculous implications. Norvani traditionalists called for genetic containment protocols. Scientists from both worlds demanded research access. A week later, Jinnah stood at her window, watching security teams patrol the perimeter of the diplomatic compound. Protesters and supporters gathered beyond the gates, holding signs in both human and Norvani languages. "I've been recalled to Norvax," she told Taiwan when he joined her, "and simultaneously ordered by Earth authorities to remain here for ongoing observation." Taiwan slicked his arm around her waist. "What do you want to do?" Jinnah leaned against him, finding comfort in his warmth. "I want what any parent wants, safety for my child. But I don't think either of our worlds can offer that now. This baby has become a symbol before it's even born. Then perhaps we need to go somewhere else entirely," Taiwan suggested quietly. The Centauri colonies have offered us sanctuary. Jinnah turned to face him. Leave, abandon our diplomatic posts, our responsibilities. Sometimes the greatest responsibility is to protect something new and fragile, Taiwan replied. Our child deserves the chance to define itself, not to be defined by the fears and hopes of two entire worlds. That night, as security alerts flashed across her terminal and demands from both governments filled her message queue, Jinnah made her decision. She would not be a pawn in an interplanetary political game. She would not allow her child to become a specimen or a symbol. She placed her hand on her growing abdomen and felt a response, not just movement, but a sensation like a question, a reaching out. The baby's developing telepathic abilities were already active, seeking connection. We'll find our own way, she promised softly. Somewhere your story can be your own. 6 months had passed since Jinnah and Taiwan made their daring escape from Earth. The small transport ship that carried them to the independent colony of New Horizon had slipped past both Earth and Norvani patrols with the help of sympathetic pilots. Now they lived in a modest home on the outskirts of the colony's main settlement, where species from 12 different worlds coexisted with minimal interference from their home governments. Jinnah stood in the nursery, watching the sunrise through the large window. The room was painted in soft colors that would be soothing to both human and Norvani vision. In the crib, little Sumin slept peacefully, her skin a beautiful blend of human golden tones and subtle Norvani blue highlights. At 3 months old, she was developing faster than either human or Norvani infants, already able to lift her head and follow movement with remarkable focus. She's still sleeping, Taiwan asked quietly, entering the room with 2 cups of morning tea. Jinnah nodded, accepting her cup gratefully. She slept through the night again. Dr. Rice says her sleep patterns are more human than Norvani. Thank goodness for small mercies, Taiwan said with a smile. Norvani infants typically required only 4 hours of sleep per day, leaving their parents exhausted. Su Min stirred in her crib, her eyes opening to reveal their most striking feature, irises that shifted color based on her emotional state, currently a peaceful blue-green. As she saw her parents, the colors warmed to gold, and a wave of affection washed over both Jinnah and Taiwan. Su Min's telepathic abilities had been present from birth, though thankfully limited to simple emotional projections rather than full thought communication. Good morning, little one, Jinnah said, lifting her daughter from the crib. Su Min reached one tiny hand toward her mother's face, her fingers finding the sensitive neural points at Jinnah's temple with unerring accuracy. The touch created a deeper bond, allowing Jinnah to sense her daughter's contentment. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the chime of their communication terminal. Taiwan answered while Jinnah prepared Su Min's breakfast formula, a special blend designed by New Horizons' medical team to meet her unique nutritional needs. It was the colony administrator, Taiwan said when he returned to the kitchen. A diplomatic delegation has entered orbit, both Earth and Norvax representatives this time. Jinnah felt a familiar twist of anxiety. What do they want? The official reason is trade negotiations with the colony. Unofficially, Taiwan sighed. They've requested a meeting with us. 6 hours later, Jinnah and Taiwan sat in the colony's meeting hall, Su Min cradled protectively in Jinnah's arms. Across from them sat Elder Minji from the Norvani High Council and Ambassador Li from Earth's diplomatic corps. Both were more moderate voices in their respective governments, which Jinnah took as a hopeful sign. Your departure created quite a diplomatic incident, Elder Minji began. Both our worlds have spent considerable resources searching for you. We had no choice, Taiwan replied calmly. Both governments were treating our child as property rather than a person. That perception was unfortunate, Ambassador Li acknowledged. But much has changed in the past months. Your situation has forced both our worlds to reconsider many long-held assumptions. Jinnah raised an eyebrow skeptically. In what way? Elder Minji's expression softened slightly as she looked at Su Min. Your daughter's existence has sparked a scientific revolution. Research teams are now collaborating to understand how human and Norvani genetics could combine when all previous studies suggested incompatibility. More importantly, Ambassador Lee added, public opinion has shifted. When you disappeared, both our peoples realized they had pushed too hard. There were protests demanding more respectful treatment of your family. Jinnah and Taiwan exchanged glances. They had deliberately avoided news from their homeworlds, focusing instead on creating a stable life for Sumin. What exactly are you proposing? Jinnah asked carefully. We would like to invite you to return, not as subjects of study, but as bridges between our worlds, Elder Minji explained. A new interspecies cultural exchange program has been established. We would like you to lead it. Sumin stirred in Jinnah's arms, her eyes shifting to a curious purple as she sensed the stranger's emotions. A gentle wave of questioning curiosity emanated from her, touching the minds of everyone in the room. Ambassador Lee's eyes widened in surprise. Is that? Yes, Ta-Wan confirmed. She communicates emotionally for now. As she grows, her abilities will likely become more refined. Extraordinary, Elder Minji whispered, her Norvani reserve momentarily forgotten. Jinnah protectively adjusted Sumin's blanket. She is not a scientific curiosity. She is our daughter. Of course, Ambassador Lee said quickly. That's precisely why we're here. Both our governments recognize that your family represents something precious, proof that our differences can create something beautiful rather than divide us. The discussion continued for hours, with both diplomats sharing the changes that had occurred since Jinnah and Taiwan's departure. New protective laws had been established guaranteeing the rights of interspecies families. Research protocols now required informed consent with no government pressure. When the diplomats finally left, promising to return the next day to continue discussions, Jinnah and Taiwan walked slowly home through the colony's central garden. Sumin watched the colorful native flowers with fascination, her eyes shifting through a rainbow of colors. What do you think? Taiwan asked as they sat on a bench beneath flowering trees reminiscent of earth cherry blossoms. Jinnah gently stroked Sumin's cheek. I think they're sincere, at least these two. But I'm not certain about returning. We don't have to decide immediately, Taiwan reminded her. We can negotiate conditions, guarantees. Jinnah nodded thoughtfully. New Horizon has been good to us, but Sumin deserves to know both sides of her heritage, to visit the world her parents come from. That evening, as they put Sumin to bed, Jinnah found herself remembering the phrase she had repeated so often during her early days on Earth. I will never date a human. The memory made her smile now. She watched as Taiwan sang a gentle lullaby to their daughter, his voice soft and soothing. Sumin's eyes gradually shifted to deep blue as sleep approached, her small hand gripping her father's finger tightly. Life had taken Jinnah on a journey she could never have imagined. From rigid diplomat to fugitive to mother of a child who represented the future of two worlds. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like both Earth and Norvax might be ready to learn from them rather than study them. As Sumin drifted to sleep, she projected one last emotional wave. Pure contentment and love that enveloped her parents like a warm embrace. Whatever we decide, Jinnah said softly to Taiwan, we'll decide as a family. Taiwan nodded, taking her hand. From diplomatic crisis to family. Not what either of us expected when we first met. Jinnah smiled, thinking of how far they had come. Sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. Outside their window, the stars of New Horizon shone brightly, while in the distance, the diplomatic vessels from Earth and Norvax orbited the colony, waiting, hoping, for a new beginning that none of them could have imagined possible just 1 year before.